Welcome to another episode of All About Art. If you're new here, All About Art is a podcast with the mission of demystifying the professional art sector by publishing interviews with people working in the arts as they talk about their education, career paths, and more, spotlighting the cultural sector as a really great place to work. I also produce solo episodes like this one, where I talk about different topics in the art world from the point of view of someone who works in it. Right now, most full-length interviews on All About Art are audio only, but depending on where you're tuning in, you can either watch the solo episode or you can just listen in. Before we continue, if you do tune into this episode and you enjoy it, help us out by hitting the thumbs up or rating the podcast over on the streaming site of your choice, as it really helps us continue to produce the show. And now, let's dive into the episode. Since graduating, I've worked across multiple roles within the arts industry, and I've gained exposure to different organizational structures and cultures across the arts. And honestly, across many industries, you hear the same story. If you want to build something meaningful, you have to leave the stability of a 9-to-5 and take the risk. In this episode, I want to challenge that idea because innovation doesn't only happen outside institutions. And a concept that helps explain this is intrapreneurship. I feel that to properly define the term, we must first ground it within our understanding of entrepreneurship. It is defined as the activity of setting up a business or businesses, taking on financial risks in the hope of profit. But taking that kind of risk isn't easy. You usually need some financial stability or at least a safety net, and culturally, we tend to celebrate that risk. We're often told that individual hustle and personal drive are what lead to success. And this is where intrapreneurship comes in. So intrapreneurship is defined as a system that encourages employees to act like entrepreneurs within their own company. Intrapreneurs are self-motivated, proactive, and action-oriented individuals who take the initiative to develop innovative products or services. Putting aside some of the corporate jargon, it really just means starting or running a project as if it were your own, but inside an existing organization. It gives you room to experiment without personal risk, but it also comes with constraints because you're working inside an institution. And we'll get on to these pros and cons in greater depth later in this episode. And while definitions are helpful, intrapreneurship shows up in ways we don't always notice. That, when reframed, can give inspiration for those of us trying to navigate major but maybe more traditional institutions. In my recently published book, Working in Art: How to Build a Career in the Art World, I interviewed a variety of arts professionals for insights into their careers and advice for those at all levels within the field. It is a practical, accessible book for anyone who wants to build or further their career in the arts. In the chapter, Working in Responsible Culture, I spoke with Caitlin Southwick, founder and director of Key Culture, who explained that she sees opportunities for arts professionals to grow in the area of sustainability in the arts through leveraging intrapreneurship in already existing roles, because dedicated roles in sustainability and art are, frankly, really hard to come by. To her, intrapreneurship is advocating for adding certain skills and projects to your job role, advocating for what you believe to be important, and being able to pitch certain projects as beneficial to the institutions to have more autonomy over your role. She gives the simple example of even adding small suggestions to projects already under your purview. If you draft contracts, you might add clauses about issues you care about, of course, with the approval of your director or manager. Overall, a more subtle but still deeply impactful way to integrate your own personal values and development goals into your job role. Intrapreneurship isn't just limited to those with an entrepreneurial business mindset. It is a set of skills all of us should work on to personalize our careers and projects to our own interests, especially within a traditional 9-to-5. A recent example that comes to mind is my interview with Ben Luke. I really recommend checking out the full episode, released just a few weeks before this. But in short, speaking with him offered valuable insights into how intrapreneurship can shape a career in podcasting, particularly in identifying opportunities to create new formats and reach new audiences while remaining connected to larger media organizations, like the art newspaper. One takeaway from his experience is that intrapreneurial projects can expand your influence inside an organization. Entrepreneurship can also involve embedding oneself within larger institutions, which can take the form of artist in residence programs in corporations or other non-traditional creative environments, which is specifically relevant also to artists. For example, a collaboration between Google and the Jacquard Artist Residency in 2019, one example of many, brought international artists to collaborate with Google's technology engineering teams on projects. Artists were able to use corporate resources, including funding and research support, to explore intersections of art and lifestyle innovation/tech. The residency culminated in artist-led projects investigating how individuals can benefit from the pervasive effects of technology on daily life. So programs like this demonstrate that entrepreneurship is not only possible in arts and culture, but it can shape how the sectors evolve, and it can provide great opportunities for artists who may want more support on certain creative projects or new inspirations. For those interested in supporting the arts but not working within the arts full-time, initiatives like this offer cross-sector collaborations, and it can really help embed artistic thinking into other fields. If you're wondering whether entrepreneurship fits your career, it can help to look outside of the art world, in my opinion. Popular culture and media provide potentially overlooked case studies that highlight both the opportunities and the limitations of intrapreneurial roles. A striking example comes from BuzzFeed in the early 2010s. Writers were encouraged to experiment with YouTube videos designed to go viral. This gave employees a space to build personal brands, something that traditional editorial jobs actually don't allow that often. One really famous result was the Try Guys. By 2018, they had left BuzzFeed and started producing the same style of content independently. This transition illustrates how entrepreneurship can serve as a launch pad, providing both exposure and skill building, and how sometimes the pursuit of creative autonomy and greater earning potential pushes individuals towards full entrepreneurship. In many cases, that confidence only comes from experimenting inside an organization first. A different example comes from Vogue. In September 2025, Vogue appointed Chloe Mal as head of editorial content for American Vogue, succeeding Anna Wintour, who had shaped the magazine as editor-in-chief since 1988, which we all know. She first joined the magazine in 2011, and over time, she helped develop new digital content, including the podcast called The Run-Through with Vogue. This is a good example of entrepreneurship inside a major institution. And it also shows how employees inside an institution can push new formats and reach new audiences. And it caused Mal to be entrusted with steering editorial strategy at the highest level. I'm not saying the podcast was the reason, but I'm saying it led to it, or it maybe contributed to it a little bit. And rather than spinning off a separate entity, Vogue leveraged Mal's experience with social platforms to modernize and expand the magazine's appeal while retaining institutional continuity. Her additions to the company were clearly valued, and it's an example of entrepreneurship. Innovation happens inside the organization without creating a new company or a new structure. Now, let's dive into a pros and cons list about entrepreneurship as compared to entrepreneurship. And I'll be doing it from my perspective as the creator of the podcast you're tuning into currently. And I'll also be sort of basing it off of the conversation I had with Ben Luke, who runs a podcast as part of a bigger organization. Let's start with the pros of intrapreneurship. One of the biggest advantages is financial support. A company's budgets would be able to cover the costly expense of recording equipment, studio hire, and even post-production. Working on a podcast is part of your 9-to-5. Your time and efforts are paid for, which is amazing. As an independent podcast host, I remember buying my first microphone and thinking about the best quiet place to record my first few episodes. As the podcast develops, you end up finding systems and routines that grow with time. For example, if you've been watching these episodes now on YouTube that show me in a recording studio, the lovely space I'm in is at 60 Pall Mall, which have been a generous partner of the podcast and allowed me to record really consistently. But there have been moments where I used my friend's flat because it was located in a convenient part of town and there was less background noise in her apartment. So there have definitely been way less glamorous moments of recording this podcast. And more than just the recording, Editing can be difficult to find a consistent routine for. High quality editors are amazing, but really hard to afford. And now I have a more sustainable system with freelancers, which is amazing, but also all of this is an ongoing personal cost, or it's my own time. With institutional backing, hiring help, whether that is equipment or another person on post-production, wouldn't mean more unpaid personal sacrifice, which, to be blunt, is the work that happens to keep this podcast alive. Additionally, constantly problem solving where and how to record does actually take attention away from the content itself. Secondly, another pro of intrapreneurship when it comes to podcasting is access to infrastructures and pre-existing reputations. I feel that it would be easier to secure high-profile guests with the name of an institution like the art newspaper behind a podcast, as it opens doors to conversations with figures that would maybe have been originally hesitant. And that's something that Ben Luke also agreed with. As an independent podcaster, this takes time to build. Early on, people will say no, and to be fully honest, even now, I get rejected by potential guests, which is sad, but we move. It is a bit of a chicken and egg problem, as high-profile guests build a reputation for your podcast, but you need a certain established reputation already in order to attract them, and institutional credibility accelerates that process. As we said earlier, it also gives you initially higher quality produced content and exciting spaces to invite guests to. Thirdly, another pro, you have built-in distribution and discoverability. Institutions have mailing lists, social media channels, and press teams in place that can really positively market your podcast to the right people, especially when the podcast is framed as a part of an institutional output rather than an individual's side project. For me, distribution has been a full-time job. I could talk at length about having to choose between Instagram, TikTok, newsletter, Substack, or Patreon, and creating and maintaining each one can be a lot. For every episode, the work to make sure that people hear the episode and find out that it's even been released is something that I like to put a lot of effort into doing nicely, but it does take a lot of time. Having even one more person dedicated to it dramatically changes what I would be able to achieve. I didn't even make an All About Art Instagram account until like 1 or 2 years into having a podcast, which is crazy. Now to the cons of being an intrapreneur. I want to start on one that I feel applies in some degree to both intrapreneurship and entrepreneurship. As listenership grows, especially in the arts, there is a lot of weight on the personal relationships that you cultivate within the sector. And this means that as the podcast grows, creative autonomy is at risk of shrinking. In institutional settings, this can show up as an external editorial tone to align with funder expectations or an institutional voice. For example, I am frequently critical of Donald Trump on this podcast, and I mention it in interviews with people. And it's opinion that I can share freely because I'm only representing myself. But maybe a particular institution like the Smithsonian, for example, if it had a podcast, would feel unable to speak out about similar feelings. So yes, risk aversion exists in all arts podcasts because relationships matter, but it's amplified institutionally. You don't always choose who you speak to, how critical you can be, or what political positions are safe to voice. Secondly, another con, dependency on institutional priorities, especially lenses more focused on profit, can make podcasts hard to justify. As an independent podcaster, my continuation is justified by personal meaning rather than metrics alone. Especially in the arts, audiences will never rival mainstream lifestyle podcasts like Call Her Daddy. But that doesn't make the work less culturally valuable. That being said, you need to know when to quit. If you're working independently, you can give yourself more of a grace period, but your time should be just as valuable a resource to you as any profit margins would be to an employer. Being an entrepreneur does mean that you have to know when to quit, although someone else might not tell you. Kind of in conjunction with the previous one, the third con is that institutions create metric pressure. Your success will be more measured, and continuation will need to be justified by these numbers, whether that be downloads, engagement, or audience growth. The sneaky upside to this, though, is that intrapreneurs tend to start with higher quality production from the jump, which helps metrics from early on. Ultimately, to oversimplify it, entrepreneurship offers control and voice, while intrapreneurship offers scale and support. So where does all of this leave us. Intrapreneurship and entrepreneurship are often framed as opposites, but in reality, they exist on a spectrum. Speaking with Ben Luke and reflecting on my own experience producing All About Art, what becomes clear is that both approaches can propel a creative career forward in different ways. And what's interesting is that these paths are not fixed. The reality is that there isn't one correct model. What intrapreneurship ultimately reminds us is that innovation doesn't only happen outside of institutions. So, as you think about your own career, whether you're working in the arts or simply passionate about supporting the arts, the question might be, where do I currently have the most room to create something meaningful? Is it within an organization that already exists, where you can shape projects from the inside? Or is it by building something entirely new on your own terms? Only you can really answer that question. And sometimes the most exciting careers emerge from learning how to navigate both. Bringing this episode to a close, thank you so much for listening.